Chapter 3. Lenore. A confusion too genuine to be dissembled and too transparent to be misunderstood. The Leavenworth Case. I turned as a young lady entered in the finest red silk taffeta ensemble I'd ever seen. Her dress was a gathered confection dripping with lace trim, ruffles, bows, even macrame fringe. All bustled in the latest fashion, complete with a jacket-style bodice with a high, square neckline that perfectly accentuated the woman's delicate neck. The young woman had the quintessential compilation of features, from the petite nose that no doubt wrinkled adorably when she laughed, to the sparkling blue eyes that probably captured a man's heart the instant they locked onto him. Her hair was the color of the first daffodil of spring, softly curled as it hung from a twisted roll atop her head. And yet, beneath the perfection lay an innocence, a naivete, that evoked pity in me. "I am afraid we have not been properly introduced," said my father, rising to greet her. "If it is not too much to assume, you must be the niece Mr. Jackson has mentioned to me. Miss Kilthorpe, was it?" Mr. Jackson had made no mention of her to me. Neither had my father. Perhaps he'd assumed my relationship with Mr. Jackson would not make it as far as meeting the family.
"Oh, yes. How rude of me. I'm all aflutter at the moment. I am Miss Kilthorpe, but you may call me Lenore."
"Lenore?" I repeated, latching onto the familiar name.
"Yes, like Poe's Dead Woman," she said, her voice taking a surprising dip. "Not an alluring history, I must admit, but it was my father's favorite poem, and so my father named me such upon her death."
"So a loving memorial nonetheless," said my father.
"You are both most welcome," said Lenore, motioning that we should be seated as she settled across from us. "How gracious of you to come on such short notice, Mr. Green. However did you hear so quickly?"
I gathered my own, now fearfully simple, red and white bustled skirts about me as I sat. In this young lady's presence I no doubt looked more like a candy cane than a woman worthy of conversation, but I tried to collect myself and sit up straight and proper, all the while wondering why Mr. Jackson had failed to mention that he had his young and beautiful niece staying with him. It put quite a different light on his interest in me. He had no need of a young woman to dote upon him in his old age. It looked like he already had one. "We intended to visit Mr. Jackson this afternoon, and only just happened to be approaching when we heard what sounded like a gunshot," explained my father. "Please let us know how we might be of some assistance to your household."
"How considerate, but I am afraid." Suddenly it became apparent that it was tears which had made the blue eyes sparkle so, as Lenore removed a handkerchief hidden amongst the lace edges of her left sleeve. "Oh, it is too terrible to comprehend. My uncle, it appears he has shot himself."
I merely nodded my head. It was as I had suspected. There really was no other reason why a gunshot should be heard echoing down Fifth Avenue. But then an even more terrible thought occurred to me. Had I been the cause? No. I shook my head at myself in my mind. No, it couldn't be. My dismissal of him couldn't possibly have caused him to give up on life altogether. My heart pounded, and I was thankful for the gloves on my hands, which hid my suddenly sweating palms. I was grateful when my father beat me to the question that threatened to pass my lips. "Are you certain?"
"Well, yes," Lenore stammered. "Why, what do you mean?"
I shook my head. "I wonder the same. Mr. Jackson does not seem the type of man to kill himself." "Have you notified the police?" my father asked. Lenore seemed shocked at the suggestion.
"Why would we?"
"It is possible it was not suicide, which means the police should be informed, as well as the coroner. I saw Mr. Hammond upon our arrival, but I have not seen a constable," which was surprising, given by now the corner cop most assuredly must have heard reports of the gunshot from the milling crowd.
"But it must have been. We all heard the gunshot and ran to his study," said Lenore with a frown. "When we opened the door, my uncle he had a hole."
Surprisingly, or perhaps not, since I'd only ever seen it happen in novels, no one fainted, not even Lenore, at this suggestion, though she did grow pale and seemed to think it best to distract herself with her handkerchief, rather than dwell on the image no doubt doomed to grow into a nightmare in her head. "When you say we all, who do you mean exactly?" I asked Lenore, eager to turn her from the memory.
"Why, the entire household. Myself, Mr. Farwell, Boyle, Bridget, Kate, and Murphy, my lady's maid. You must excuse my impertinence. I am not familiar with your family other than your uncle. Are all those people staff, or... Yes, I'm sorry. We're quite devoted to one another here. Other than my uncle, I'm alone, so I think of the staff as my family. Immediately, Lenore rose in my estimation.
Did Mr. Jackson feel the same? My father asked.
Lenore shook her head sadly. No, I'm afraid he did not. The newness of her situation was evident in the tremble of her voice whenever she mentioned her uncle. I often have to remind myself that he was of a different generation, of a time before the war, when battle lines had to be drawn, including within one's own house. It had only been 7 years since the end of the war between the North and the South, but the scars remained indelibly across America. The first poem I'd ever published had been entitled Ode to Grant, which I wrote when Ulysses S. Grant had become the 18th president. I glanced at my father, who knew as well as anyone what the war had cost. Mr. Farwell was, the only one my uncle really appreciated, Lenore continued, smiling slightly at the thought. He was working with my uncle as his private secretary, writing a book regarding his experiences in India. The sound of a man clearing his throat interrupted her statement, and we turned to find the coroner had joined us. Mr. Hammond nodded to father in recognition, but turned his focus to Lenore.
Miss Kelthorpe, if I might have a word.
Of course. She stood swiftly and excused herself, stepping out into the hall with the man who seemed a giant beside her. My father and I sat quietly together, our ears perked toward their conversation. From out in the hall I could hear the low baritone voice of Mr. Hammond saying, I'm afraid an inquest must be called under these circumstances. An inquest?
Yes, the surgeon does not believe your uncle killed himself, and I am inclined to agree. We must call a detective immediately, whilst I collect a jury from those outside.
A detective?
Yes, Miss Kelthorpe. It is standard practice to hold a coroner's inquest as soon as possible when the cause of death is called into question. We must collect evidence while we can. I will assemble a selection of peers from the crowd. They will view the body, then listen to witness testimony from everyone in the house, including yourself. If you would like, I can call someone to come sit with you during this period. It is a lot to take in. I stood before my father could stop me. Pardon me, I said, joining them in the hall. Perhaps I might be of assistance. I would love to sit with you, Miss Kelthorpe, if you'd allow. I nodded my head and was pleased to see Lenore, lost in shock, nodding her head in mirror image. Very good. I shall ask the staff to prepare a room for the event, then send for the detective and assemble the jury. There is no need for you to worry, Miss Kelthorpe. Everything will be arranged for you. You are excused until such time as we have need of you, said Mr. Hammond, with a bow.